That isn't a farm. It's an empty patch of dirt. That was what HOA President Linda Baines said while a paving crew rolled hot black asphalt over the garden behind my house. My tomato rows were already gone. My irrigation lines had been ripped from the ground. The sign identifying the property as a registered agricultural site was lying face down beneath the tire of a dump truck. I had warned Linda twice that the land belonged to me. She ignored both warnings. She said 27 visitor parking spaces would bring more value to the community than what she called my weekend vegetables. What she did not know was that I had a stamped county survey, an active agricultural registration, security footage of every truck that entered my property, and laboratory soil results taken just 31 days before construction began. So I did not yell. I photographed everything. I saved every email. Then I called the State Department of Agriculture. 3 days later, inspectors drilled through Linda's brand new parking lot. 3 months later, the HOA's entire $120,000 annual budget was gone. I saw the haze before I saw the machines. It rose above the cedar fence behind my house in slow gray waves, carrying the bitter smell of hot asphalt across the road. I had spent the morning delivering produce to 2 restaurants in town. When I pulled into my driveway, a dump truck was blocking the rear gate, and a road roller was crawling across the place where 6 rows of tomatoes had been standing before sunrise. For several seconds, I could not understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed Linda. She stood beside the paving crew in a spotless white hard hat, pointing at a laminated site plan. Behind her, fresh yellow lines marked 27 parking spaces across my garden. I got out of my truck and walked toward the foreman. "Shut the equipment down," I said. "You're on private property." Linda stepped between us. "The board has already approved this improvement," she said. "You had plenty of time to cooperate." I looked past her. My drip irrigation pipes had been dragged from the soil and twisted into a pile. The wooden planting beds Ruth and I had built together were splintered beneath the excavator tracks. The pollinator strip beside the fence had been scraped down to bare earth. "You received my deed," I told Linda. "You received the survey. This property is not part of your HOA." She tapped her clipboard with one finger. "Your objections were reviewed. That is not the same as having authority." Her smile disappeared. "This community needs parking. 84 families should not suffer because one man refuses to clean up an overgrown garden." The foreman looked uncomfortable, but he did not stop the roller. I could have stood in front of it. I could have blocked the trucks or grabbed a tool. I could have given Linda the confrontation she clearly wanted. Instead, I took out my phone. I photographed the contractor's name, every license plate, the broken gate, the discarded agricultural sign, and the dark stain where hydraulic fluid had leaked into the exposed soil. Then I opened the security application on my phone. My cameras had captured everything from the moment Linda's crew cut the chain at 6:12 that morning. She thought she was building a parking lot over a hobby garden. She had no idea she was destroying a registered agricultural business and recording the evidence for me while she did it. That garden had never been a hobby. 22 years earlier, before the clubhouse, the stone entrance signs, and the rows of identical roofs, the land behind my house had been open pasture. My wife, Ruth, was the one who saw what it could become. I worked as an irrigation technician, repairing pumps and water systems for farms across the county. Ruth taught elementary school, and every summer she filled our kitchen windows with trays of seedlings. When she was diagnosed with cancer, the garden became the one place where the hospital could not follow us. We built the raised beds together. I installed drip lines beneath the soil so she would not have to carry heavy watering cans. She planted tomatoes, basil, and long rows of yellow flowers that drew bees from half a mile away. After she died, I could not bring myself to let the garden disappear. I expanded it instead. I registered the parcel as a small agricultural operation, received a local producer number, and began selling vegetables at the Saturday market. Eventually, 2 restaurants started buying directly from me. One ordered heirloom tomatoes and fresh herbs. The other used my edible flowers and honey. The income was modest, but it paid the property taxes and kept the land productive. More importantly, every row still carried Ruth's fingerprints. The HOA development arrived years later. My house and garden were never included within its boundaries, but the clubhouse was built directly against my eastern fence. At first, the relationship was peaceful. Then the board asked whether I would sell them a strip of land for overflow parking. I said no. 6 months later, they asked again and offered less than half its assessed value. I said no again. Linda Baines became HOA president the following spring. Within weeks, she started calling my garden an eyesore. She complained about my work truck, my rain barrels, and the small roadside table where I sold extra produce. Then a white envelope appeared in my mailbox. Across the top, in red capital letters, it read, "Final Landscape Compliance Notice." The HOA was ordering me to remove the garden from land it had already tried, and failed, to buy. The notice accused me of 3 violations: unapproved agricultural activity, visual blight, and commercial use inconsistent with community standards. None of those rules applied to me. My property had its own parcel number, its own deed, and its own access from the county road. I did not pay HOA dues because I had never joined the HOA. Linda knew that. The board knew it too. I sent a written response that afternoon. I attached the deed, the stamped county survey, and my agricultural registration. I reminded the board that entering the property without permission would constitute trespassing. I also included a photograph of the brass survey marker at the eastern corner, only a few feet from the clubhouse fence. Linda replied the next morning, "Your objections have been reviewed and rejected. The board will proceed with the community improvement plan." I read that sentence twice. She had not denied receiving the documents. She had simply decided they did not matter. 2 days later, Linda arrived at my gate with the board treasurer and a younger man carrying rolled construction plans. She wore dark sunglasses and pointed through the fence at my planting beds. "This area will accommodate 27 vehicles," she said. "It will improve access for weddings and community events." "You mean the land you tried to buy from me?" Her mouth tightened. "This strip has functioned as part of the community for years." "No," I said. "Your guests sometimes look at it through a fence. That does not make it yours." The younger man opened a colored site map. My garden had been shaded green and labeled Future Community Expansion. There was no county seal, no surveyor's signature, and no recorded parcel boundary. It was a drawing made to look official. Linda glanced at my old pickup and muddy boots. "People who own valuable property usually maintain it properly," she said. "They do not sell vegetables from folding tables." I let her finish. Then I asked who had been awarded the paving contract. She said the board had selected the most qualified company. That evening, I opened the HOA's public meeting records. The contract had gone to Baines Outdoor Solutions without competitive bids. The company's registered manager was Linda's brother-in-law. The board minutes listed the project cost as $38,000. However, an attached payment schedule showed that a large deposit had already been taken from the HOA's emergency reserve. I saved copies of everything. At 6:12 the following morning, my security system sent an alert. 3 dump trucks, an excavator, and a paving crew had entered through my rear gate. I called the sheriff's office while watching the security feed. By the time I reached home, the excavator had already removed most of the topsoil. The crew had piled tomato vines, broken irrigation pipes, and pieces of my wooden beds beside the fence as though they were ordinary construction waste. A deputy was standing near Linda's white SUV. She had given him the same colored map she had shown me. "This is HOA common property," she told him. "Mr. Mercer is trying to interfere with an approved safety project." I handed the deputy my driver's license, deed, and county survey. He studied them, then looked toward the paving crew. "This appears to be a boundary dispute," he said carefully. "I can document the complaint, but I cannot determine ownership on the roadside." Linda smiled as though she had won. "Then tell him to stay away from the equipment." The deputy did not tell me that. He warned everyone to remain calm and advised me to contact an attorney. It was frustrating, but he was right about one thing. Touching the machines or confronting the workers would only give Linda an opportunity to make me look dangerous. So I remained outside the active work zone and kept recording. The foreman walked over while Linda was speaking with the deputy. "I was told the ownership issue had been resolved," he said quietly. It was not. I showed him the survey marker beside the fence and the email Linda had received with my deed attached. His expression changed. He looked back at Linda, then reached inside his truck and handed me a copy of the work order. Near the bottom, beneath the paving instructions, someone had typed, "Owner has objected. Proceed under HOA authority." That sentence mattered. It proved this was not an accidental boundary mistake. Linda had ordered the contractor to continue after being warned that the land was privately owned. Before the crew covered the final exposed section, I photographed a dark pool beneath the excavator. Hydraulic fluid had leaked into the soil near the herb beds. Crushed stone had been mixed into the remaining topsoil, and runoff from the unfinished parking surface was already draining toward the portion of the garden the crew had not reached. I collected nothing from inside the active construction area. Instead, I documented the location, the time, and the equipment responsible. Then I found my agricultural registration sign in the debris pile. It had been pulled from its posts, bent in half, and thrown away. Linda could no longer claim that she had not known how the property was being used. That afternoon, I called the State Department of Agriculture and explained what had happened. The woman receiving the report remained quiet until I mentioned the asphalt, the hydraulic leak, and the commercial crops. Then she asked one question. "Mr. Mercer, do you have laboratory soil results from before construction began?" I looked toward the filing cabinet in my office. 31 days earlier, one of my restaurant customers had required me to test that exact soil. "Yes," I said, "I have results for every growing section." The woman paused. "Then please protect those records. An inspector will contact you today." Inspector Maya Ortiz arrived the next morning in a state vehicle with soil sampling equipment in the back. She did not begin by asking whether I disliked the HOA. She asked for records. I gave her the county deed, the stamped survey, my agricultural registration, and the contracts from the 2 restaurants I supplied. Then I placed the laboratory report from 31 days earlier on top of the stack. Maya studied the dates. These samples were taken from the area that was paved? 6 separate sections, I said. The tomato beds, the herbs, the flowers, and the strip beside the main irrigation line. The report showed clean agricultural soil with normal nutrient levels and no petroleum contamination. Then I showed her the videos. One clip captured the excavator scraping away the topsoil. Another showed the hydraulic fluid spreading beneath the machine. A third recorded Linda standing beside the bent agricultural sign while directing trucks farther into the property. Finally, I gave Maya the contractor's work order. She read the sentence at the bottom twice. "Owner has objected. Proceed under HOA authority." "That is unusually clear," she said. Maya explained that removing the asphalt would not automatically restore the garden. The paving crew had placed crushed stone over the growing area and compacted it with heavy equipment. Some of that material had been driven into the remaining soil. The hydraulic leak also had to be tested, and the new surface had changed the direction of runoff toward the untouched portion of my property. If the contamination had spread, the HOA could be responsible for removing far more than the visible parking lot. By noon, Maya's team was drilling through the asphalt. They collected samples from beneath several parking spaces, along the drainage edge, and near the location of the equipment leak. Every sample was sealed, numbered, photographed, and logged. Linda arrived halfway through the inspection. "You have no authority to shut down HOA property," she said. Maya looked at the parcel map in her hand. "This is not HOA property." Linda immediately changed her argument. She claimed the garden had been abandoned, that no legitimate business had operated there, and that the parking lot improved public safety. Maya pointed toward the restaurant contracts, sales records, and agricultural registration spread across the hood of her vehicle. "An agency does not decide whether a farm is legitimate based on whether you respect it." Linda's face turned red. She demanded to know how long the investigation would take because the HOA had scheduled a grand opening ceremony for Saturday morning. Maya told her that the site should not be used until the initial results had been reviewed. Linda left without agreeing to cancel anything. That evening, the laboratory contacted Maya with its preliminary findings. Crushed construction material had been mixed deep into the growing layer. Petroleum residue was present near the former herb beds, and runoff from the new parking surface had already carried contaminants beyond the edge of the asphalt. The restoration would require excavation, certified replacement soil, and a rebuilt irrigation system. Then an email arrived from the HOA. It was a cheerful invitation featuring a photograph of Linda holding a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. "Grand opening of our new visitor parking lot. Saturday, 10 o'clock. Linda planned to fill the contaminated site with cars before the inspectors could stop her. By 9:30 on Saturday morning, she had nearly succeeded. Luxury SUVs covered almost every yellow-lined space. White folding chairs faced the clubhouse entrance, and a red ribbon stretched between two temporary posts. Linda had even invited a photographer from the local community newspaper. She was not simply celebrating a parking lot. She was trying to make it permanent. If residents used it, photographed it, and applauded its opening, she could argue that removing it would harm the entire community. Anyone who objected would appear unreasonable. I stood outside my fence with a folder beneath my arm. Linda noticed me immediately. "You are not invited," she said. "I am standing on my property." She turned toward the crowd before I could say anything else. "This project represents progress," she announced. "For too long, a neglected strip of land prevented this community from reaching its full potential." Several residents applauded. Most of them had never seen my deed, the survey, or the garden before it was destroyed. Linda raised the oversized scissors. That was when two state vehicles entered from the clubhouse road. The applause stopped. Maya Ortiz stepped out of the first vehicle with a county environmental officer and two technicians. The second vehicle carried barriers, warning signs, and a portable drilling rig. Linda lowered the scissors. "What is this?" Maya held up an official notice. "This site is under an active agricultural contamination investigation. All vehicles must be removed immediately." People began looking at one another. Linda tried to laugh. "You cannot close community property during a private celebration." Maya unfolded the county parcel map. "Who authorized construction on parcel 17B? "I did," Linda said. "The HOA controls this land." "Then you should be able to identify the recorded owner." Linda pointed toward me. "He abandoned it. The board approved an improvement plan." I walked forward and placed my deed, stamped survey, and agricultural registration on the registration table beside her ribbon-cutting program. Maya compared the parcel numbers. "The recorded owner is Caleb Mercer," she said. The parcel is registered for commercial agricultural production, and the agency has received evidence that the HOA was warned before construction. Linda claimed there had been a misunderstanding. Maya opened a printed email. Your objections have been reviewed and rejected. The board will proceed with the community improvement plan. She read Linda's own words aloud. No one applauded this time. Residents began moving their vehicles as technicians installed yellow barriers around the parking lot. The drilling rig rolled across the new pavement and bored through the first parking space, while the newspaper photographer continued taking pictures. Dark fragments of asphalt, crushed stone, and contaminated soil rose from the ground inside the sampling tube. Then the HOA's insurance representative arrived. The agency had contacted the insurer after issuing its preliminary notice. He told the board treasurer that the policy might cover an accidental boundary mistake, but probably not deliberate construction after written proof of private ownership had been received. Linda stared at him. You're saying we are not covered? I am saying the carrier is reserving its rights because the documents suggest intentional conduct. Maya handed the board a temporary restoration order. The site could not be used, sealed, altered, or reopened. All contracts, invoices, emails, and other communications connected to the project had to be preserved. The first preliminary estimate was attached, $103,400. That amount did not include my destroyed crops, canceled restaurant contracts, legal expenses, or the final cost of replacing the soil. Linda looked across the fenced parking lot she had planned to unveil that morning. Every car was gone. The red ribbon hung between two warning signs, and a drill was cutting holes through the asphalt her board had just paid to install. But the number that finally destroyed her confidence arrived 3 days later. The final restoration total was exactly $120,000. That was the HOA's entire operating budget for the year. The emergency board meeting began with Linda demanding a special assessment from every homeowner. She wanted each of the 84 families to pay for what she called an unexpected environmental compliance issue. Not one word in her proposal mentioned my deed. Not one word mentioned the warning emails. And not one word explained why her brother-in-law's company had been hired without competitive bids. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Residents stood along the walls and crowded into the hallway. Some were angry with Linda. Others were still angry with me because they believed I had invited the state to bankrupt their community over a vegetable garden. Linda took advantage of that confusion. She stood behind the board table and pointed in my direction. Mr. Mercer refused every reasonable compromise, she said. Now he expects innocent families to finance an excessive restoration plan. I waited until she finished. Then I placed a binder on the table. The first page was my deed. The second was the stamped county survey. The third was the agricultural registration Linda had called meaningless. After that came the 2 warning emails, including her written response stating that my objections had been reviewed and rejected. I displayed the contractor's work order on the clubhouse projector. Owner has objected. Proceed under HOA authority. The room became quiet. Then I showed the payment records. Baines Outdoor Solutions had received a large deposit before the board formally approved the final contract. Several invoices charged the HOA for drainage materials that investigators could not find beneath the parking lot. Other charges listed more crushed stone than the site could physically contain. The board treasurer stared at the screen. I never approved that amount, he said. Linda insisted the discrepancies were administrative errors. That was when the paving foreman entered the room. He had brought his own records. He told the residents that Linda had assured him the HOA controlled the property. When he asked about my objections, she instructed him to continue. Then he repeated the sentence that ended her presidency. Mrs. Baines told me, once the asphalt is down, he will not be able to make us remove it. The room erupted. Residents demanded to know why they should pay for deliberate trespass. One woman asked why the emergency reserve had been used to benefit Linda's relative. Another resident held up the insurance letter, showing that coverage had been questioned because the board ignored written proof of ownership. Linda struck the table with her palm. This project was for the community. No, the treasurer said. The community is who you expected to pay when it failed. The board voted that night. Linda was removed as president. Her access to the HOA's accounts was suspended. The contract records were turned over to the county investigator, and the remaining board members authorized a claim against Baines Outdoor Solutions for the inflated and undocumented charges. The proposed special assessment failed. The HOA still had to fund the immediate restoration, but the new board froze all non-essential spending and began pursuing reimbursement from Linda, the contractor, and any applicable insurance coverage. The community's festivals, clubhouse renovations, landscaping upgrades, and social events were canceled for the year. The Department of Agriculture's final order divided the $120,000 loss clearly. Removing and transporting the asphalt cost $28,000. Excavating and testing the damaged soil cost $34,000. Certified replacement soil, drainage repairs, and a new irrigation system added $31,000. My destroyed crops and canceled contracts accounted for $17,000. Inspection, engineering, and legal expenses consumed the final $10,000. The morning after the meeting, the excavators returned. This time, they were not paving my garden. They were tearing Linda's parking lot apart. I watched the bucket bite into the first yellow-lined space and lift a slab of asphalt into the air. Beneath it lay crushed stone, compacted soil, and the broken remains of the irrigation system Ruth and I had installed together. Linda stood near the clubhouse entrance for less than a minute. Then she got into her white SUV and drove away. By sunset, all 27 visitor spaces were gone. In their place was a fenced excavation pit stretching across the property line. It was a $120,000 hole where Linda's authority used to be. But when I looked down at the exposed ground, I did not feel victorious yet. The soil tests were improving, but the inspectors still had not cleared the land for food production. Winning the case did not guarantee that Ruth's garden would ever grow again. For the next 6 weeks, the garden looked more like an excavation site than farmland. Truck after truck carried away contaminated soil. Inspectors tested each exposed layer before allowing the restoration crew to continue. Clean topsoil was brought in from a certified agricultural supplier and spread carefully across the property instead of being compacted by heavy machinery. I designed the new irrigation system myself. It followed the same routes Ruth and I had planned years earlier, but this time I added shut-off valves, drainage controls, and permanent markers along the property boundary. Something else changed too. The people from the HOA began showing up. At first, it was only the board treasurer. He apologized for believing Linda's version of the dispute without ever asking to see my documents. Then 2 families arrived with shovels. The following weekend, more than 20 residents helped rebuild the planting beds and repair the fence. Some brought lumber. Others brought food, seedlings, and bags of compost. They were not responsible for what Linda had done, but they understood how easily her authority had gone unquestioned. The new board adopted a rule requiring an independent survey and written owner approval before any HOA project could approach private property. Contracts involving a board member's relative now required competitive bids and full disclosure. The Department of Agriculture returned in early spring. Maya walked the rows with a clipboard, collecting final samples from the restored soil. 1 week later, she called me. The parcel is cleared for agricultural production. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. Winning the dispute had protected my deed. Hearing those words gave me the garden back. I used part of the compensation to build a small greenhouse near the eastern fence. Above the door, I placed a wooden sign bearing Ruth's name. The first crops grown there went to the local food bank. Later, I began hosting Saturday gardening lessons for residents who had never grown anything before. Even the clubhouse kitchen started buying herbs from me. The following summer, I planted heirloom tomatoes where visitor parking space number 14 had once been painted. The bees returned to the yellow flowers beside them. Near the gate, I installed one final sign: private agricultural land, documents on file. Linda believed that once asphalt covered my garden, ownership would no longer matter. She was wrong. The asphalt preserved the tire tracks, the contamination, and every deliberate choice she made after receiving my deed. It did not turn my property into HOA land. It turned her parking lot into evidence. By the end, 27 visitor spaces had disappeared. The HOA's entire $120,000 annual budget had been consumed, and the garden Linda called worthless was growing food again. A clipboard may look official, a board vote may sound powerful, but neither one can erase a property line. So tell me this: if an HOA began paving over the land your family had built together, would you stop the machines immediately? Or would you let them finish creating the evidence that destroyed them?